Good afternoon, and welcome to Talks at Google in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today, it's my enormous pleasure to introduce my former state representative and former Congressman Barney Frank. He joins us today to discuss his memoir, Frank, A Life in Politics from the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. Confession, I'm completely starstruck. Barney has been a hero of mine since I moved to Boston in 1973, Beacon Hill State Rep. And I spent a long time working on this introduction that would do justice to the man and the great book he's written, but it was getting completely out of hand. And Barney will be the first to tell you he's not a person with a whole lot of patience, so we're just going to cut through anything else I would have said, and let me just welcome one of Massachusetts' most astute and effective politicians, a great fighter for people who can't always fight their own fights, former Congressman Barney Frank.
Thank you, John. Thank you, and I'm very happy to have a chance to talk. I will talk some. I don't know how you open these bottles without squeezing them and getting the water out. But I'm, you know, any awe is reciprocal because I am not naturally good with things. I have been in a lifelong war with inanimate objects and have mostly lost. And, you know, things like opening a water bottle. I have had 3 relationships with men in my life. The current one is, of course, the most meaningful by far. And they were all very different in a lot of ways, but I can hear each of them in my head saying in exactly the same tone of voice, Barney, don't touch that, because I will break it. I will say, when it came time for 32 years in Congress, I had a large staff, and so I was able to take full advantage of the improvements in communications as they came along without myself personally doing them. And I now have one assistant, Courtney Flynn, who does the work for about 30 people very well. But I had to go back. I was not using computers myself very much, so when I sat down to write the book, I started to do it. And I kept hitting combinations of keys not intended by anybody who ever made one. And finally, my husband was in a Walgreens and saw an outsized yellow plastic keyboard, which could be plugged into my computer. And that made it possible for me to write the book. With one exception, there was a key right next to the space bar that I kept hitting that kept shutting me down. And so he's very handy, and he applied a little high-tech solution. He pried the head of the key off. So now if I tend to hit it, I get a sharp pain in my finger that says, don't do that. But anyway, I am very happy to be here and a great admirer of the company. I'm going to talk some and then open it for questions. The frame of the book kind of suggested itself to me. Jonathan mentioned he moved into Beacon Hill in 1973. That was the year after I had been elected to the state legislature. My first year in the legislature, it was the year. One of the things that's sort of serendipitous about my career from the standpoint of LGBT issues is that it is virtually coterminous with the movement for LGBT rights, not because of everything I did. It's just that, given when I was born, when I got involved, I was just starting my career when Stonewall hit. And there really is no social movement in the history of this country, and maybe of any other, which has so clear a delineation point. I mean, I can tell you, because I was working for the mayor of Boston, I was in charge of, among other things, liberal causes. And as a closeted gay man, I was kind of hoping I would meet other gay men through my advocacy. And I can tell you, there was no gay political activity going on in Boston in 1968, 69, and 70. It just wasn't there. Actually, the first Gay Pride Parade was in 71. I rode in the second one in 72. But I had just started, and When I started out, I got involved in politics because I had a view of how I would like to change society in the direction of fairer treatment for people, less discrimination, more personal freedom, less economic inequality within the market framework. And I was worried that that was not going to work very well because I was what we then universally call the homosexual. And there was obviously a conflict between being someone so unpopular. I realized I was gay when I was 13, and I was just devastated by it. I thought about that when I read about this incredibly stupid comment by Ben Carson, and there's a point there. Intelligence is segmented, in my view. People can be absolutely brilliant about some things and be a moron about others. So Ben Carson apparently is able to separate conjoined twins in a miraculous kind of thing, and then announces that he believes being gay is a choice. And my response was yes. At 13, I was a typical teenager who couldn't wait to be a member of the most unpopular minority around. That's what every teenager's dream is, to be despised by all of your peers. I later learned that Carson said that was because people who go to prison sometimes engage in gay sex. Well, the notion that being in a maximum security prison is any kind of a choice in the first place, it should have given a clue to him that this was not wholly voluntary. Anyway, I thought I could never get very influential because I'd never get a high position in government. As the years went on, this is 67 when I first got a job, there's an interesting shift. They're not related, but the prejudice based on sexual orientation, and even lately, I'm very happy to see, gender identity diminishes substantially. But respect for government also diminishes substantially. So by the end, I thought I would never be able to have a great impact on society because I could never be influential in government. It reached a point where I was able to be influential in government, but government wasn't influential in society. And as I said, it is literally what people have said. Gee, did you ever think that you could be married while you were still in Congress to another man? And wouldn't that have been very controversial? And I said, yeah, if you'd asked me even in 2004, which was the year that we first began to have marriage here, if I could get married while still a member of Congress, yeah, it would have been very, very controversial. And in the end, Jim and I did marry in my last year in Congress, and it did generate a lot of controversy. There was space limitations, and a number of my colleagues were very angry that I didn't invite them. It was a very different kind of, although there was, and I have to say there's a partisan aspect. I came back to my office one day and there was a very attractive piece of pottery from a member of Congress as a wedding present who had not been invited. And she was a Republican, one of the more reasonable ones. But she had voted for the Defense of Marriage Act, had voted, in fact, even worse, for a constitutional amendment that would have invalidated, not only prevented future marriages, but invalidated marriages that had already existed. So I brought the president back. She wasn't there, I left it there. And she called me somewhat puzzled. Was there something the matter? And I said, yeah, how can I accept a present from you celebrating an event that you tried to wipe out? And I was struck. She said, yeah, I was a coward. And she later retired from Congress. I think she was an example of a disturbing trend, not she, but the reasons behind it. That is the rightward movement of the Republican Party, which a reasonable conservative like her could not tolerate, so she had to quit. But at any rate, the government became less and less popular. I want to talk, I'm very happy that we got increased acceptance. Acceptance actually is a too weak a word. We got an absence of the prejudice. I think the reason for the defeat of the prejudice is very simple. We stopped hiding. The prejudice was the prejudice literally ignorance. And there were two factors. As millions of us became honest about who we were, a little about terminology. In the 70s, 80s, I think until fairly recently, when we would be honest about who we were, there would be well-meaning, non-bigoted people, but still a little uneasy, and they would say, "Oh, look, I'm happy that you're happy being gay or lesbian, but why do you have to discuss it so much? Why can't you just be there without telling everybody?" And finally, I pointed out to them that this notion that we who were gay and lesbian discussed our sexuality more than others was simply wrong. I pointed out straight people talk about their sexuality every bit as much as gay people do. The difference is when we do it, it's called coming out. When they do it, it's called talking. And nobody goes through a day without referring to partner, girlfriend, husband, etc. At any rate, I think that's clearly it. First of all, by our being honest about who we were, we destroyed the stereotype. We were not any particular person. And I also think there's something about a prejudice which is so little based on reality that you have to be told whom you are supposed to apply it to. I mean, if you have thought that these are terrible people, and then you find out that a number of people whom you previously admired are those terrible people, that kind of causes some mental concern. How bad could it be if I couldn't tell? It's also the case that people found out a lot of people close to them were gay or lesbian. So that prejudice ultimately went away, and it's an interesting political thing. As late as 2004, George Bush used this as a weapon against the Democrats. In fact, John Kerry, who's very supportive, had to worry about it. In fact, I accompanied John Kerry, I talk about this in the book, to a meeting of gay people in Washington, the Human Rights Campaign, and he said, "Well, how do I explain my opposition to same-sex marriage?" And I said, "My recommendation is that you don't explain, you just say you're against it." He said, "Well, if I just say that, they're going to think it's just for political reasons." And I said, "That's what you hope." And think about it. If someone has taken a position you dislike, wouldn't you rather, I mean, not judging him morally, but in terms of your own self-interest, wouldn't it be better if it was an expedient one rather than one deeply held? Because if it was deeply held and sincerely meant, you'd have a hard time changing it. But if it was expedient, you could work on it. And I said, look, in my experience, he said, well, how can you not explain it? I told him, I had an incident once. There was a debate about whether or not to seat a Democrat versus a Republican in a contested election in Indiana. And I liked the Democrat, but it seemed to me, as you looked at it, there was no way to tell who had won. It was very close, the ballot. Some of the ballots were indecipherable. So I voted not to seat the Democrat. Tip O'Neill was then the speaker. A wonderful man, but a deep partisan, as he should have been the speaker. And I voted against it, and somebody said, how did the speaker respond? I said, well, he was mad at me for not voting to seat the Democrat until I clearly explained to him my reasons, at which point he became furious. When you have disagreed with someone, you almost always make it worse by telling them why. You are explaining to them why they were wrong. So in my experience, if you're going to have to disagree with people, don't say it. So Kerry said, well, okay, but how would I explain myself then to the people who are against marriage? What do I say to them? I said, I think in the history of the world, no one has ever demanded that anybody explain why he agrees with him. Said, has anybody ever said, I agree with you? Well, I need to know why you agree with me. It doesn't happen. But at any rate, that was 2004. By the last election, 2014, Republicans were trying desperately not to argue the case. Best example, federal courts in Pennsylvania rule that the Pennsylvania rules against same-sex marriage are unconstitutional. The Republican governor of Pennsylvania then announces that he will not appeal the decision because he's up for re-election and he doesn't want to have to defend that position. I mean, it has entirely flipped as a wedge issue. So that one I'm happy about. We still have to get legislation passed. And there was a problem as recently a few years ago on the transgender issue. And that is now resolved. When I first started introducing gay rights legislation in 1972, it wasn't just entirely a rational objection. There was what I call the kind of blech factor. a lot of straight men in particular, the notion of two guys having sex troubled them. For some reason, for a lot of straight men, as you know, the notion of two women having sex, kind of a turn on. But two guys, no. At any rate, we wore that down. In 2007, when we tried to get transgender inclusion in an anti-discrimination bill, I realized I was running into that same factor. That was too new. That was too troubling to people. And it's a sign of how things have gotten better. The transgender community themselves and others, we've been able to kind of get rid of that ick factor in that situation in a much shorter period. So we're now ready to do this. But here's the deal. There will be no further legislative advance for LGBT people until and unless you get a Democratic House, Senate, and President. And one of the things about respectable opinion today is that because of the excessive partisanship that's been engaged in by some people, there's been an overreaction that condemns all partisanship. In fact, you cannot have, and never have had, a functioning democratic society without political parties. Absent political parties, absent some groupings of people based on general common views, then it's pure personality. I mean, the people who wrote the American Constitution, the founding fathers, had two attitudes towards parties. They hated them and they formed them. They said they were terrible ideas, faction they called it, and they were busy forming parties, and they took it seriously enough. So Alexander Hamilton was shot by Aaron Burr. That was an example of how seriously they took party differences. Parties are irrelevant, and the fact is that while the Republicans are not any longer actively going after LGBT people because they understand that that's not a good thing with the general public, particularly with younger people, they are also committed to never doing anything positive. So we get to questions. The question is, what's the future for LGBT rights? It depends entirely on the party in power. If the Democrats again get the presidency, House, and the Senate, problems with that, with the House redistricting, you'll see a national bill adopted. The tougher problem for me, because that's the good news, is what do you do about government? Now, in my view, a healthy society consists of a very active private sector, which is the way you create wealth, and I believe in the market system, and a public sector which has three purposes. One, it's to set down rules for the private sector. It's to contain private sector activity within certain kind of bounds. Absent that, competition has a negative effect. Just as one example, when during the financial crisis, people asked some of the people in the financial community, why are you doing this? And the answer was, I got to. My competition is doing it. I asked the head of Citicorp, Chuck Prince, at one point, why he was doing a certain maneuver with his balance sheet. And he said, and why he wasn't being more honest about the debts of the company. He said, because if I put all these on my balance sheet, Goldman Sachs will beat the hell out of me in the market. So you need some rules to constrain abuses and check people from taking undue advantage. There are some things you need government for that no private sector is going to do because of the externalities of it. The benefits are for everybody. That's particularly true in environmental areas. And then finally, unless you believe in the extreme, I think, of the Ayn Rand philosophy, you want to provide some minimum level of decent comfort for people who aren't going to make it on their own. Obviously, you need inequality or a capitalist system doesn't work. And people who work hard deserve more than people who don't. People who are talented are going to get more than people who don't. But I think we're not prepared to let people totally just starve to death. And so that's part of what you do through the public sector. Throughout our history and in most other democracies, stable capitalist democracies, there's a tendency to have two parties. Sometimes they're in three or four groupings. But there's a kind of a more liberal side and a more conservative side. Both sides understand that you need both. You need a good private sector and a good public sector. And the competition is where you draw the line. In America, the Republicans would be pushing the public sector back some, give more freedom to the private sector. Democrats, the opposite. But in each case, until recently, people recognize the importance of both. The unusual thing about American politics today is that the Republican Party, to a great extent through the Tea Party, is heavily influenced by, and in the House it has been controlled by, people who disagree with that. They do not see any great value in the public sector. And that is the cause of the breakdown. People say, whatever happened to bipartisanship? Well, what happened to it is factual. It's Barack Obama got elected and the Republicans said no. When the Bush administration in the fall of 2008 came to the Democrats and said, the economy's falling apart. We need you to do some things to help us. We did. We voted for the TARP, which will clearly go down in history as the most highly successful, wildly unpopular thing the government ever did. And we knew it was going to be unpopular. When AIG comes in, by the way, AIG came into the Bush administration and said, we need $85 billion to cover the commitments we made for something called credit default swaps, insurance against securities, because we don't have the money. It turns out they not only didn't have the money, they had no idea how much they owed. Because a few days later, when the Bush administration told us that they were going to need $700 billion to lend to cover debts, and they said, and they were showing how they arrived at the figure, and they said, and $85 billion for AIG. Somebody said, no, you already told us that. We were paying attention. And their answer was, oh no, this is an additional $85 billion. AIG not only couldn't cover its debts, it had no idea how much it owed. Aside, by the way, is that the founder of AIG, Maurice Greenberg, known as Hank after the baseball player, is now suing the federal government on the grounds that he was not treated fairly when the federal government came up with $180 billion, ultimately was, to cover the debts his company had incurred. I have characterized that as the arsonist suing the fire department for water damage to his property. But that's the dilemma we have now. My frustration is this: there are, we have this generally acknowledged fact right now. Whether or not you think it's a problem varies ideologically. As the country is getting richer, the distribution is very unequal, and an overwhelming percentage of the additional wealth is going to a very small number of people, and the great bulk of the population is kind of just held even. I believe that's the explanation, and I'll wrap up with this and throw it open. The dilemma that Democrats have faced, the question is, from our standpoint, we are doing things that we think are in the interest of working people. Why is it that white working class and middle class men don't vote for us? As I note in the book, the only group of white men who vote in the majority Democratic these days are gays and Jews. Any other demographic group votes no. Now there are enough women and African Americans and Hispanics, Asians. Asians, interestingly, had originally many of them voted Republican, but the anti-immigrant sense, sort of ever since Bill Clinton, they've been a majority Democrat, with the exception of the Vietnamese for historical reasons. But the question is, why do people who earlier would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Johnson, Kennedy, why do they now vote for union busters or for people who are against the kind of things that would be good for them? There was an initial view that it was because they were angry over the social issues. It was God, guns, and gays. Guns are a part of it. But I think that analysis was basically wrong. I wasn't sure of it at the time, but I've become convinced it is. That is, for people who think that the reason we don't get these white working class votes is their opposition to social issues, how do you explain the fact that same-sex marriage is now overwhelmingly popular, including with many of them? I think it's the economy. It's what James Carville said in '92 during the Clinton campaign. It's the economy, stupid. Here's what's happened. From 1945 to 1975, America ruled the world economically as a result of World War II. Actually, it even began in 1940. Every developed economy in the world was devastated by World War II except us. Ours grew because we were the place. We were physically undamaged, and we had this enormous production. And until the mid-'70s, if you were a white man, not subject to racism or gender prejudice, and you were willing to work, you didn't have to have a high degree of specialized skill. You didn't have to have a college education or even high school education. You go into a factory and make a very good living as long as you're willing to work. And that was, in fact, the exception. But people took it as the norm. Beginning in the 70s, the rest of the world was catching up to America. And now, increasingly, it wasn't possible for America to make everything. And Americans working in basic commodities, in manufacturing, were losing out to other countries where people could work more cheaply. The result is, and frankly, what's happened is, and we're in a place where it's the case, increasingly America's comparative edge over the rest of the world was in the high-end area, in high technology, and in intellectual property. And we have done very well there. So we have a situation where working-class men are angry that their relative economic position has eroded. And that's led them to be anti-government. I do not believe that these are people who were philosophically anti-government. I think the paradox is that they're too pro-government in some ways. That is, they are convinced that if the people running the government, particularly the Democrats, who are the party of government, really cared about them, we would have done more to respond to their economic situation, which leads us into a vicious cycle, because they get angry at the Democrats who they say, oh, you're too busy. And here's where the other issues come in. Their view is that we only care about women and blacks and gays, and we're neglecting them. It's not that they're objectively against them in the first place, but they're like jealous siblings. And so they vote for people. I mean, their frustration is that the government hasn't done enough to respond to their economic plight. And so then they vote for people who make it less likely that the government will do that. And then they make it even less likely, and you get this anti-government vicious cycle. I believe if we had the resources to improve government's performance, put more people to work in the construction area, fixing our infrastructure, good economically as well as in terms of serving the broader economy, return to the point where a kid could graduate from high school from a lower working class family and go to the state university without going deeply in hock. Have returned to the situation where states subsidize higher education. Pick up some of the health care costs that they meet. There are a lot of things we can do, but most of them cost money. And the vicious cycle is we don't have the money to do these things. So my solution is two things. People say, how do you restore faith in government? Well, it's beyond faith, it's reality. The only way for us to do this is to do what I would like to do anyway, promulgate programs within the market structure, no way interfering with our ability and our capacity to run a very effective capitalist system, but provide programs that reduce this inequality. And then the question is, okay, but where are you going to get the money? We can't even raise gasoline taxes now to fix the roads, because the current Republican Party thinks Dwight Eisenhower was a dangerous radical when he promulgated this interstate highway program. So I have two proposals in the books. First of all, I think it is time substantially to reduce America's military budget. We are the strongest nation in the world, but we are the strongest nation in the world by an excessive margin. I think it is a good thing that the largest air force in the world is the U.S. Air Force. I do not think it has to be the case that the second largest air force in the world is the U.S. Navy, which is the case. Now, since it seems to me unlikely that the Navy and the Air Force will go to war, we could probably reduce their total. Example of I know there are bad guys out there. I don't like the terrorists. I cheer when they're killed. But nuclear submarines don't stop terrorism. If they did, it'd be over. They don't have any. I mean, here's what I think happened to us, briefly. Before 1940, America had a very small military because we had the best defense in the world, two of them, the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And given the technology then, that was pretty safe. Pearl Harbor made us a little nervous, but even that, way out in the ocean. Then we built up, because Hitler was an existential threat to our society. And when Hitler was through, Joseph Stalin, a terrible, vicious gangster, has the Soviet Union, and for many years, they are a threat to our existence, although I think that began to wane. When the Soviet Union collapses in 1990, for the first time since Hitler, there is no threat to America's existence as a free society. There are bad guys going to harass us, but literally our existence is not in doubt. And so George H.W. Bush and then Bill Clinton began substantially to reduce the military. And that's where 2001 comes in. We are then attacked by the terrorists, Americans murdered, a terrible thing, but not a threat to our existence as a society. What you get are people in the Bush administration who philosophically believe that it is America's role to be the world's leader. They believe that it is America's moral obligation to enforce order in the world. They have been frustrated by their inability to sell that to the American people who don't feel threatened. So there was a successful effort to build the terrorists up to the level of threat represented by the communists and the Nazis. They are morally no better than Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler, but fortunately they don't have 1/100th of the devastation power. The fact is that, yeah, we need to fight terrorists, but it is a different order of magnitude of fight compared to what we had to do before. And we have been persuaded that that's not the case. Instead, what we have is massive American intervention. Oh, I mentioned the Air Force. Here's what we're up against. In the Wednesday Wall Street Journal, the day after the election, 2012, two guys from the Bush administration wrote an article saying, we're very worried now that Obama's won because he's not going to expand the Air Force the way we need to. And they say, no, it is true that no American has been killed by enemy air power since 1953. This is 2012. And it is also true that American air power has dominated every battlefield entirely since then. And they go on to say, but because of this, some people don't realize that we need to expand the Air Force. I was one of them. And they say we need to be able to respond anywhere, anytime, any place. There were two objections to that. One, it's enormously expensive. Two, it's not workable because they want to do it through the military. I wish we could make people in Iraq get along better. I wish we could get Shia and Sunni to cooperate. I wish we could diminish corruption in Afghanistan. I wish we could bring about a coherent society in Yemen or Libya. We can't, and we certainly can't do it with the military. We have the best military in the history of the world. They can do very well what a military can do. They can stop bad things from happening, but militaries can't make good things happen. So I believe we could substantially reduce the military by $100 billion a year, in no way endanger our safety, nor diminish our capacity to intervene when it would do some good. The other area, and I'll make this one quick, how do you get money for the states and cities to do things? Very simple. You stop putting people in prison because of the use of recreational drugs if they don't otherwise hurt people. The war on drugs has been a much bigger failure than anything else, and it can't be done more efficiently. People say, well, you know, we just got to run this better. I mean, why should it cost more to send someone to prison than to send them to the state university? Very simple answer. Very few people try to escape from the state university. I mean, that costs some money. So I think the American people are ready for both. I think the American people, they don't want to send troops back into Iraq and Afghanistan. They don't want to lock people up for marijuana. I mean, you know, one of the great hypocrisies in America today, cocaine. Many people know that there are a lot of high-functioning people in various places in this society who are cocaine users. But if they come in the wrong social class, they'll go to jail. It's part of the racial problem. There was a statistic in New York City, 86% of the arrests for marijuana use were black and Hispanic. You people have been in Manhattan. Do you really think 86% of the marijuana users are black and Hispanic? It must mean that your white friends are an unusually high percentage of users, because you know they do. So that's my solution. I'm pretty satisfied with our progress in LGBT rights. I want to reverse this anti-government trend. I think it's bad for us. It's bad for dealing with climate change. It's bad for enhancing the quality of life. I think the private sector is very important, but there are some things important to our quality of life that the private sector isn't supposed to do, and we have to pool our resources. And there's this obstacle. So my mission for the next few years that I have a chance to do anything is to argue for reduced military spending. And you can't reduce military spending unless you reduce the objectives. You can't just make it more efficient. That's wishful thinking. And to take criminal penalties. The principle I would have is this. It should not be illegal to ingest any substance unless that substance is going to clearly cause you the kind of long-term harm that the rest of us are going to have to pay for medically, or if it makes you likelier to hurt other people. Taking heroin doesn't make you a violent criminal. Trying to get the money to take heroin does, and so we can deal with that. So that's the principle. You do not, you outlaw only those substances which make people likely to be a social menace. you can't apply that principle entirely because it's too late to ban alcohol again, which is clearly the substance that makes people the most dangerous to others. But there's no reason to ban these others. I believe if we could free up that money, we could do a lot of things that would improve the quality of life in this society, diminish inequality without in any way hurting our productive capacity, and we'd all live less unhappily ever after. I'll take questions at this point.
It would be interesting to how do you guys balance, or how did you balance? It seems like, so small businesses are the engine of our economy. They're the biggest employers, of people in this country. But as you guys balanced that need to regulate, so one thing that's kind of popping to mind, for example, would be Sarbanes-Oxley. We did it because of Enron and all those guys, but the burden for that regulation really fell on the smaller companies who just kind of couldn't afford to do that in a meaningful way. So how did you guys go?
Well, in my area, we tried to, we used a $10 billion asset figure for banks. And in fact, for example, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Elizabeth Warren's brainchild, which I'm very proud of, they send out bank examiners to see if the banks are doing the right thing. But we exempted banks that have less than $10 billion in assets from being examined by them because that takes up time. And I know some of the community banks object to the regulations. I tell you, part of the problem is the lawyers. And I've said to the community bankers, well, what's your problem? Well, we have to spend a lot of money complying with the volcker rule. The volcker rule applies to J.P. Morgan, Chase, and Bank of America. It has to do with very complex derivative transactions, which these smaller banks don't do. Oh, but my lawyer said I got to make sure that I demonstrate this. So I complained to some lawyers, and they said, well, we're worried about malpractice. I do favor writing into the financial reform law some explicit exemptions. There were things that we never thought were going to affect the smaller banks, but lawyers make them nervous. So that's, I think we can do more in that regard. And with Sarbanes-Oxley, over the last few years, that's the bill that deals with accounting practices, and it came because of Enron and other great scandals, and it didn't come out of the air. There have been a number of, the level at which you have to kick in now in terms of your capitalization is up to, I don't know, 500 million or something like that. And so that is one where experientially people did decide to exempt smaller businesses. Yeah.
Great to have you here. I wanted to ask about Dodd-Frank and the Affordable Care Act. One thing they seem to have in common is people are trying to dismantle them. And I wonder how Dodd-Frank is doing from your perspective, first of all, and second of all, whether this attempt to dismantle things that were pretty big initiatives that were voted for is something that's always happened in our world, or it's something new and different.
Let me take the last question first. No, this is not typical for things to be contested this far, a whole presidential election after. And it is a manifestation of the Tea Party. The reason is this. This is true of the Supreme Court. There's a decision in Latin called stare decisis. Let the decision stand. You're dealing with a case, if you're on the Supreme Court, even if you think it should be decided one way, if it had previously been decided for many years the other way, it should take a lot to unsettle it. The reason is you need some stability in society. If every time a new party comes in, they undo everything the old party did, you have an awful lot of irregularity in the system. And ordinarily, after stuff gets passed in 2009 and 10, by 2016, people would not be trying to repeal it. It is a mark of the extremism of the Tea Party people that they are still doing that. As to what's happening, by now, neither one is going to be legislatively tampered with because the president doesn't want to. And, well, many of the Republicans don't like, for instance, financial reform. They know the public does. And people say, well, the public doesn't understand it. No, they don't understand the specifics. They do think it is better to have those rules than not. But in both cases, well, particularly in financial reform, these are going to be issues now in the 2016 presidential election. People sometimes say, oh, the parties are the same, but the 2016 presidential election will have clearly defined issues. If the Republicans win, that will be the end of financial reform. They will go back to where we were. I think that would be a mistake. There was some effort to kind of chip away at the financial reform. The president actually signed a bill that began that. The outcry against that persuaded him not to do that again. Nancy Pelosi took the lead. Elizabeth Warren did. I get more calls from the press about an issue than I had since I'd retired. So at this point, both of them are going to stay where they are, unless the Supreme Court decides that a sloppy drafting on the health care bill means that people in states that don't have an exchange, which is most of them with Republican governors, will lose their health care. God knows what will happen with that. But both of them will be on the table in 2016. And as I said, that's unusual. Ordinarily, if something has survived for 2 years, it's gone through a presidential election, it's not back into the mix because you get it's very hard for society to run things if it's always going back and forth. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
So hyperpartisanship and gridlock sort of characterize the government now. Why do you suppose that's happening now over the past 5-10 years?
Good question, and it's the past 6 years, very precisely. And the reason it's happening is this. The Republican Party, which has traditionally in America been the conservative party which recognizes the importance of government and the importance of the private sector, but feels that the private sector should be given more room, has transmogrified into a party that consists of a lot of people who don't think we need much of a government at all, and who are very angry about it, and who do not regard politics as disagreements between people of goodwill. Newt Gingrich started this, but of a need to defend basic values against immoral people. In 2008, in January, George Bush went to Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, the leaders of the Congress, two pretty partisan Democrats, and said, we're in an economic slump. The Democrats had taken over in 2007. We need a stimulus to keep the economy going. They said, yeah, you're right. How can we do this? And here's the deal. When a Republican is president, the Democrats have conflicting incentives. One, to harass him, because he's the other party. But two, to help him, because we believe in government. And if the government is dysfunctional, that's bad for us. We want things to work. That used to be the case with the Republicans. Yeah, they don't like Bill Clinton, but they don't want to see the government collapse. You have now, particularly in the House, and some in the Senate, but not a majority of the Republicans, they have no incentive to be cooperative. First of all, they want to embarrass and harass Obama, and two, they want the government to look bad, too. So in 2008, when Bush asked for a stimulus, Reid and Pelosi gave him one. By the way, if they were being partisan, they would have said, hey, 2008, presidential election this year. Bush says the economy is going to look bad. Oh, isn't that terrible? Because that would help the Democrats. Presidents get blamed. Instead, they gave him a stimulus. Just about a year later, Obama comes to office after the recession that he inherits, a terrible recession, and says, I need a stimulus. Aside. He didn't say I need a stimulus. You've seen the signs. They say the American Recovery Program. Here's the reason. For some reason, Nancy Pelosi is a wonderful woman and very able, but she believes in focus groups. Focus groups, you get people who don't have strong opinions, and you give them these issues and you ask them what they think. Well, the problem is there was a correlation between not having a strong opinion on an important issue and being an airhead. I mean, well, they have focus groups in September, October, the presidential election year. Who is undecided about Bush versus Kerry or McCain versus Obama? If you have any views at all, you almost certainly have one or the other. Well, the focus groups told them that the stimulus, economic stimulus, was a bad word. So they decided to call our plan, the Democratic plan, the Economic Recovery Act. I was not in that, wasn't in my committee, so I wasn't in on it. But I did say, that's counterintuitive because in my experience, you don't want to call it stimulus, you want to call it recovery. Everybody I know would rather be stimulated than recover. So I don't understand why you think that's better. But the Republicans almost unanimously voted against the stimulus under Obama. When Bush came to us in September of 2008, 2 months before the presidential election, and said, geez, you got to do these things to lend money to the banks, we gave him more support than the Republicans because we believed that we had to save government. What happened has been that people like Bob Dole or George W. Bush are seen as too soft for a variety of reasons, including the reaction to the interventions we needed to help the banks. The Republican Party has been taken over now by very angry people, particularly in the House. And that's the cause of the hyperpartisanship. Gridlock started in 2009, 2010, we had a Democratic House, Senate, and President. We got a lot done. By the way, when George Bush became president in 2001, he had a Republican Congress, but his biggest issue that year was called No Child Left Behind. You know who was his biggest collaborator in passing No Child Left Behind? Ted Kennedy. I mean, George Bush had a lot of Democratic cooperation. And just a historical fact that bipartisanship ended when Obama won. Senator McConnell said his #1 goal was to defeat Obama, and he has never gotten from the Republicans the cooperation we got from Bush. Now, that leads me to the last point. The most interesting political struggle going on in America today, the one that can have the most longer-term impact, is the struggle within the Republican Party between mainstream conservatives and the more radical elements. And that's going to determine, I think, a lot about what happens.
Thank you for coming and your speech, and for all the work that you've done over the years for good in the world. And thank you for Dodd-Frank. I have my 401k and my IRAs and all that sort of thing. I put my money into these things feeling like the game is rigged, but it's the only game in town. How certain can I be that Fidelity is more honest than Bernie Madoff?
Very certain, because the mistake was people didn't, well, one, they are different entities. Fidelity as a mutual fund is much more highly regulated. Bernie Madoff was an individual sort of fly-by-night operation. Part of it's Sarbanes-Oxley, which has some value, and they were just regularly audited. Also, Madoff played on friends. Fidelity has a much more anonymous base of people who check it much more carefully. So there were some problems of self-dealing. Madoff obviously was the exception, and there was, and part of it was the Securities and Exchange Commission was clearly culpable, and we have beefed them up much more. Yeah.
Thank you again for your talk and all of your work. It seems to me that a lot of the issues you've discussed come down to widespread perceptual issues in the public, right? I mean, certainly
Yes.
it was the case for a lot of the LGBT issues, but now it's the case that a lot of the public seems convinced that these angry, incoherent Tea Partiers are the way to go, and that government should be dismantled, and there are threads of that going back to smearing sort of the unions in the 80s and going forward and decreasing their power by sort of selling this story in the public consciousness that they're this force for evil and so on. And now the story is that the government is a force for evil and so on. And with the floods of money into advertising and politics, that sort of allows certain people to sell that story. So I wonder what your thoughts are on how to shape that public opinion better and how to
Well, it's hard, and
overcome these forces.
we try. I do think this reality matters. That's why I do believe there are people who vote against their own economic self-interest, but I don't think I can talk them out of it. Look, they have a real problem. Their relative economic position has eroded. They can't send their kid to the University of Massachusetts the way the previous generation could, because it costs way more, partly because the state has stopped putting the money in. And that's why I seriously believe the only way we're going to break this vicious cycle, by the way, part of this anger, it has to do with the question about, when things went off the rails. The public anger over the events of 2008 and 2009 clearly had a big impact, and it's a paradox to me. We Democrats were responsible and responded to George Bush's telling us we had to do these things, and we get blamed for them. For example, and it's partly because we're the party of government, so when the government does bad things, even when the Republicans do unpopular things, we get blamed. You'll hear people denouncing the bailouts that the Democrats do. We're always doing bailouts. There were 5 bailouts in American recent history. Bear Stearns merging with J.P. Morgan Chase, AIG, the automobile, TARP, and what, I just named 4, so I'll get back to the 5th. Oh, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Every one of those bailouts was initiated by George W. Bush. Every one of them. The Democrats participated in 3, he did 2 all by himself, but people will still identify them with us. Given that, I don't think we can argue our way out of this. I think we got to have reality. That's why look, part of it is this, and this is one thing the Democrats can do, or stop. There's some things we can do by not doing that. I don't know if you know, it's an old joke. A guy goes to the doctor, says, "Doctor, it really hurts when I go like this." The doctor says, "Good, don't go like this." That was his answer. We denounce government too much. There are too many people on the left who don't like the specific acts that government is taking, and instead generalize it to, "Oh, they're all no good. The government's no good. Why would anybody vote if they believe that?" We need to respond. Well, part of it is Bill Clinton made this mistake of saying the era of big government is over, and then trying to expand particular government programs. Some liberals have decided to accommodate themselves to the anti-government feeling. "Oh yeah, I don't like government either, but let's do more here, let's do more there." The whole cannot be smaller than the sum of the parts politically any more than physically. Well, I say that, for all I know, I don't keep up. Maybe physically you guys have figured out a way that it can be, but I can tell you it's not true politically. And what we need to do, first of all, is to connect the dots. Tell people, you know, the Department of Veterans Affairs, that's not only government, that's socialized medicine. If you go into a VA hospital, you drive into a government parking lot, you go to a government building, and a government doctor tells a government nurse to stick a government needle in your ass. It could not be more government. "Oh, I love the VA. We don't like the government." All kinds of things are government. Medicare, cleaning up the streets, snow removal. We need to make that clear. But beyond that, we have got to increase government's capacity to expand, to deliver. We cannot change this as long as there is a serious gap between people's expectations of what government should be doing in their lives and what it actually does. And that's why I believe instead of stationing troops forever in Western Europe where I have no idea what they're doing, it's time to take that money and spend it at home. And instead of locking people up for smoking marijuana or sniffing cocaine and sending the cops after them and trying them and putting them in prison, then it's time again. If we had that money and government could perform better and live up to people's expectations, then it would solve itself. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So I'll also say thank you so much for coming. I grew up in a generation that kind of had this weird flip where I was taught all through elementary school and high school that activism was the way to go. I helped collect petitions for the 2004 Marriage Equality Act, so yay, thank you for that. But then suddenly around the age where I could vote and actually participate, the government kind of went, and suddenly things just kind of stopped working. And I think that I'm concerned that, especially in my generation and generations coming up, there's a lack of trust that the government is actually going to be able to do anything to help us, especially when it comes to stuff like student loans, paying for college, military spending, education for our future children, Social Security. Do you have any recommendations for how the government can go out?
Yeah, just what I said. Cut military spending and stop locking up people for drugs. And to your argument about, the people are mad at the government. You know what the problem is? The people pick the government. Why has the Tea Party been so dominant? Because they win Republican primaries, and then people vote for them. You know, Congress is not in some bubble down there. Nobody serves in the House of Representatives who didn't get more votes than anybody else in the last election for that job. And I understand the vicious cycle. People get angry. Well, here's the problem we have, though. People on the right, when they get angry at government, they vote. People on the left get angry with government and they march. You know what? Voting beats marching if you're trying to influence government. I mean, Occupy and the Tea Party. Now, I didn't agree with a lot of what Occupy did. I certainly was more in sympathy with them than the Tea Party. But Occupy was a lot of wasted effort. The Tea Party was a disciplined, get our people registered and vote. Now, I understand that's people get angry and they don't vote and it becomes worse. But the answer clear. Look, the things you said, improve college education, accessibility, et cetera. Cut military spending at the federal level. Say, you know, in every state, the most serious problem in the last 10 years has been the increase in prison budgets. Yeah, look, you hit somebody over the head. I would like there to be a wall between you and me. I don't want violent people hanging out. But people who are using drugs, no reason to lock them up. And so those are the answers. And people, now I understand people are frustrated, but they need to go vote for candidates who will do that. How much time we got? I want to go over, what's our time here? Oh, sorry, because I'm going to sign some books. We got a few more minutes. Go ahead.
The other thing that happened around 2010, 2012 is the Republican Republican redistricting that you alluded
Yes.
to earlier. We're coming up on 2020 and the census there and the redistricting there. Do you see a path forward to not just continue fighting about who gets to draw the lines to their own partisan advantage, but to get to some system that is less volatile, less...
Theoretically, I thought there was, and there's a very disturbing case now being argued before the Supreme Court. People in Arizona got a petition to create a commission to take redistricting out of the hands of the legislature, where it is almost inevitably that kind of partisan fight, and give it to a nonpartisan commission. They did that in California, and they avoided gerrymandering. Unfortunately, the Constitution says in far more specific terms than I wish it did, that, and this is for Congress, the method of choosing the members of Congress shall be decided by the legislature in each state. And the legislators in Arizona have gone to court and said, these people can't have this referendum. We're the only ones who can do it. And it sounded like in the oral argument the court was going to do that. So that's the problem. There is a way, and there was this movement to do more of these redistricting commissions in Florida and elsewhere. And I don't know what we can do about that if the Supreme Court decides that, because there is an alternative and we may not get to it. Okay, I think I'm going to sign books now if anybody wants to. Thank you for listening to me.